Assalamu alaikum and peace be upon you. I will start off our program by reading to you a verse from the Qur'an that reflects our gathering tonight. Mankind, we created you from a single soul, male and female, and made you into nations and tribes so that you may come to know one another. Truly the most honored of you in God's sight is the greatest of you in piety. Surely God is knowing, aware. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome you tonight to our first lecture of the Zaytuna Contemporary Lecture Series. Tonight's event is organized by the Islamic Society of Stanford University in partnership with the Zaytuna Institute. Tonight we're honored to have with us Shaykh Hamza Yusuf and Imam Zaid Shakir. They're from among the most influential scholars in the West, actively shaping the emergence of an Islamic tradition indigenous to America, and they seek to reconcile traditional teachings with an experience that is uniquely Western.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad. In the name of God, the Merciful, the Compassionate, and prayers and peace upon Prophet Muhammad and all the prophets. What I wanted to talk about tonight is the condition that we find ourselves in presently in the United States vis-a-vis the Muslim world. The topic here was Islam and the destiny of man. And Islam is deeply rooted in the idea that man does have a destiny, or humanity, or humankind. Muslims are ostensibly 1 out of every 5, perhaps 1 out of every 6 people in the world. At least this is what our statistics tell us. Now, obviously, an overwhelming number of those people are Muslim, largely because they were born in regions that are Islamic. In the same way that many people, in fact, I would say most people in the West, the 84% of people in the United States that consider themselves Christians are largely Christian because they were raised in a country in which the dominant faith is Christianity. And this is an observation that was made by a 10th century Islamic theologian named Imam al-Ghazali, who wrote an extraordinary book that some Western some Western researchers like Montgomery Watt feel that he influenced Descartes because he had the idea of doubting things before we assume their truth. And one of the things that he said is that he noted that people in his culture who were Jewish because their parents were Jewish, Buddhist because their parents were Buddhist, Hindu, etc. And that struck him as problematic in terms of conviction. Because as we know, belief is related to this idea of conviction, that we have a conviction. And convictions are either sound or unsound. We can have a conviction like many people before us in this country had a conviction that white people were superior to other people. And there are still some people that hold that view, but it's no longer an acceptable public view. Whereas in 1860, it certainly was, and you'll find it talked about and debated in correspondence and in public speeches. If you look at conviction, the idea of having a wrong conviction is possible, and obviously the idea of having a sound conviction is possible. This became a problem for Imam al-Ghazali, because he really felt that in order for somebody to have true faith, they really had to have a faith grounded on sound conviction, not false conviction. And he was brave enough to doubt his own faith. He was actually brave enough to call into question his own beliefs. And this is something very rare in human history, where people are willing to really look at themselves and what they believe. And I find it very interesting for us in the current situation, because we have a world in which Kofi Annan has recently stated that the tension that he sees arising, and this was a speech he gave in Germany, between the Muslim world and between the United States in particular, but in the West in general, was deeply troubling to him. Now, this is obviously a man who's privy to a lot of information that we're not privy to, given that he's heading the United Nations. So if he's deeply troubled by the current condition, then I think all of us that have any intelligence should also be deeply troubled. Now, one of the things that's very difficult for people to do, and this is something that in anthropology, if anybody's studied anthropology here, they have a concept of trying to suspend your judgments in order to understand a culture, attempting to get out of yourself. And this actually comes out of the tradition of the phenomenologists, like in the 20s, you had the German Heidegger. That was one of his core concepts of recognizing what he called your thrownness, that much of what you see, think, feel, understand was dictated by the environment that you grew up in. And he said that once you realized that, you had a serious problem. He called it an existential crisis, which led into existentialism. The crises that he felt happened to human beings at the point when they realized that in many ways they were simply historical products, that their opinions had been in essence manufactured. Now we pick and choose because there's a smorgasbord of opinions, but very few human beings have really thought deeply about many of the opinions and assumptions that they have. Very few human beings. And people that have are often very formidable people. I mean, I was fortunate enough to study in some seminars personally with Mortimer Adler, and some of the older people in the audience will probably know that name. Mortimer Adler was a philosopher. He actually lived here in Burlingame, and in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, he was very, very well known in the United States. Most people know him for a book called How to Read a Book. But he was somebody who felt that philosophy really was the duty of everybody. And this is a very American idea. It's a very democratic idea. That philosophy should not be for a rarefied elite, but actually people should think deeply. Well, he was somebody who thought very deeply about things, and one of the experiences that people studied with him often they had was what they called, his name was Mortimer, and they called it being mortified, which is when you challenged one of his core beliefs. Because it's not easy to challenge the beliefs of somebody who has very deeply thought about those beliefs. I mean, this is a very important thing to understand, that people that have thought deeply about things tend to be entrenched in positions for that very reason. They've come to certain conclusions because they've really thought deeply about it. Other people will often take their opinions from magazines, from programs that they've heard, from people that they respect. You have somebody who's running for president, and suddenly you've got your dean for president, and then when Newsweek suddenly tells us that Howard's End, as the article said, suddenly I'm holding up my Kerry poster because I've been told now he's the front runner. So I've abandoned Howard Dean because Kerry can beat Bush. Do I really know what the difference between Kerry and Dean is? They both went to Yale. I don't think Dean was a bonesman, but John Kerry was a bonesman. So he's a frat brother with George Bush, which is very interesting. So, in fact, I actually suggested to Dennis Kucinich that he attempt to get some legislation passed that prohibits Yale graduates from running for president. And he looked at me with a complete straight face and said, "That's very funny." So people will jump on bandwagons. People like to join groups. And once they join a group, they fall into group mentality, group think. Everything the group says must be right because it's my group and my group right or wrong. That's an old saying. My tribe right or wrong. My country right or wrong. In fact, my country right or wrong came from Stephen Decatur, who was an admiral in the American Navy and actually is noted mostly for the fact that he led a successful attack on the Ottomans at Tripoli and blew up the Philadelphia, which had been captured by them. But when he came back, he was hailed as a hero, and a famous toast that he made was, "Our country, may it always be right in its foreign intercourse, but our country, right or wrong." Now, it's interesting that that first part has been severed from the quote, "May it always be right in foreign intercourse, but unfortunately, when it's wrong, it's still our country," which is a very different understanding from the way that that's usually bandied about. So unfortunately, people fall into entrenched views, and groupthink is a major problem on this planet. In fact, one could argue that it is the problem. And as Nietzsche remarked, that insanity was unusual amongst individuals, but it seemed to be a norm amongst groups. And we have a vast amount of social science that confirms that insight. So now that we're entrenched in these positions, the Muslim world, whatever that means, and the West, whatever that means, you see, I mean, once we begin to use these terms, we've already lost, because we're no longer thinking. I mean, what does the West mean? I don't know what that term means, and yet I use the term, because I know that when people in the streets of Cairo are shouting, "Down with America," or "Down with the West," what do they mean by that? Do they mean down with the Florida school teacher in her 60s who flew to Baghdad to be a human shield against American bombardment? Is that the America that they're saying, "Down with America"? Or Muhammad Ali? Are they saying, "Down with Muhammad Ali"? I think if you ask them, they'd obviously say no. And the same is true for those who talk about the Muslim world in this monolithic sense. They hate us, like Bernard Lewis in Atlantic Monthly. Why they hate us? I mean, have you done a poll of 1.3 billion people and asked them all how they really feel about you? And who is the you that you're talking about? These are really serious problems that we're facing as a community. And the tragedy of our community is we've got, in this university alone, a slew of social scientists that could explain all of this to you. And how these are all fallacies, and these are all problems, and these are all actually problems of the human mind. And we have an extraordinary study, largely done in Israel, but popularized by Gorman's book, Simple Truths and Vital Lies, The Psychology of Self-Deception, which you can read and really get a deep insight into how people deceive themselves. So we know this information, and I think if there's people that look back on this present time, what they will say is it's extraordinary how much those people knew about themselves and how little they accessed that knowledge. How little they utilized that knowledge for their benefit. I mean, this to me is at the essence of our problem. That we have so much information, and yet we use so little of that information to benefit ourselves. And we allow ourselves to be self-deluded, but also to enter into a collective delusion. The delusion of the us. The delusion of the them. And so I would like to look a little bit at this idea. If we look at a traditional view of the Muslim world from Western scholars, what you will often see, and I'm always struck because I spend a lot of time reading this material, I am often struck by the selectiveness of the information. I'll give you one example. Whenever they look at, many of these Orientalists or social scientists who study Islamic culture, civilization, society, many of them, when they look at Muslim narrative of how Muslims view themselves, how they view their prophet, how they view their tradition, they will take those things that are flattering to the tradition and make remarks like, this is obviously a fabricated story. I mean, I've seen this again and again, and not by 19th century Orientalists. I'm talking about today. And then when something is unflattering, they will transmit the narration without any critical remarks. So something about the Prophet's life, for instance, very good example about the Prophet's life, the age of his wife, for instance. I mean, this is mentioned, and they will not look at all critically at the differences of opinion that exist amongst Muslim scholars about the age of Aisha. They will not look critically at the contextualization of the age of a woman in that society and what that meant in terms of marrying older men. If you look, for instance, at Washington Irving in the 19th century, Washington Irving mentions that story, doesn't bat an eyelid, and mentions how precocious Arabian girls were. Because in early 19th century America, a 12-year-old girl, it was very common that a 12-year-old girl would marry. Or even earlier. And in Jewish tradition, if you look at the Talmud, you will find that rabbis actually sanction marriage at 7 years of age with adult males, at 9 years of age. And this is in accepted rabbinical tradition. But when modern people look at these things, they will highlight and accentuate those things that they want to, and then they will set aside or ignore entirely those things that they don't. And this is a selectiveness that unfortunately exists within the Muslim world as well. However, I would say that the academic rigor that exists in the Muslim world is appalling. And this is something we in the West pride ourselves on academic rigor, on the soundness of our information, and the critical analyses by which we look at that information. So the filters that so many of us are bringing to the situation cloud it even more, and so the clarity becomes obscurity. And until we begin to really look at this, and I'm talking about Muslims, I'm talking about non-Muslims, all of us, because we're in this boat together. We're sharing the same planet. We have the same essential interests. I mean, I don't think that that is really debatable. We do have the same essential interests. And if you go to the Muslim world, you will find that many of the Muslims are struggling to ensure for their children the very same things that people here are struggling to ensure for their children. But we have allowed certain views of that world, vis-a-vis the West, to completely cloud our perceptions about that world. So in the West, we view ourselves as democratic. We view ourselves as rational. We view ourselves as open-minded, and we view those people over there, and increasingly our next-door neighbors, as irrational, as closed-minded, despotic, authoritarian. Now, stereotypes, which we use constantly, and to deny that, I think, is to deny experience. I mean, we're filled with stereotypes, not just about other people in other places, but about people here. White people have stereotypes about Mexican. Mexican have stereotypes about whites. The whites themselves, you've got Irish. You've got Italians. Now, this might not be as marked here in the West Coast, but if you go to the East Coast, where I went to school, it's a very different experience still to this day. Still to this day, derogatory remarks are made constantly in everyday conversation about different ethnic groups amongst quote-unquote white people. Polacks and Irish and WASPs. So even within the dominant ethnic group, there is disparity. and prejudice and stereotype. So when we look at these ways of viewing the Muslim world, setting aside those stereotypes is the challenge that many of us have here in the West. To begin to see things from their perspective, from people over there, from their perspective. One of the things today in the New York Times, a thriller writer, mystery writer, Mosley, I think, Art Mosley, was interviewed. And he was asked, he said, "I'm a black man in America." And the man asked him what he meant by that statement. And one of the things that he said is, he said, "I have yet to meet a black person in this country that was shocked by 9/11, which I thought was a very interesting remark, because he said, black people in this country do not see America in the same way that white people see America. They have a different perspective. And to ignore that perspective is to ignore something very valuable for the well-being of this country. And the same is true in ignoring the perspective of peoples in other places, how they view this country. How the Chileans viewed 9/11, because they had their 9/11 as well, as many of you know. Their coup on September 11th in 1973, when this government supported a coup against a democratically elected government. And the statements that Kissinger made about we can't allow the people there to make such a bad mistake, which is a very interesting statement from somebody who was a Secretary of State and an advisor, and continues to be an advisor to many of the most powerful people in this country through the Carlyle Group and his own networking. And this is somebody who obviously doesn't have a lot of consideration for the democratic process, if that's the remark he could make about people who chose to elect a leftist president. The same is true, for instance, in All the Shah's Men, a recent book that looks very deeply at Kermit Roosevelt and Eisenhower's administration's complicity in the coup of Mossadegh in Iran, which every taxi driver in Cairo knows about, every taxi driver in Damascus knows about. They all know about the coup that occurred in Iran, in which the United States actively overthrew a democratically elected government and put the Shah into power as a puppet. They all know that, but there are very few Americans that are aware of that. So to listen to that is important, because it enables us to understand better how people over there are viewing things. Because we have squandered consistently our moral authority as a nation to personify the United States. It's very interesting that in the late 40s and early 50s, much of the Muslim world looked to America as a beacon of hope. This occurred also after World War I, at the Versailles Treaty, when many of the Muslim countries were hoping that this Wilsonian ideal of self-determination would be realized in the Middle East, in South Asia, but the colonial interest reemerged and the configuration reemerged, and it was business as usual. So it is not, when we ask why do they hate us, I would challenge that statement, period, because my own experience as an American, and not simply as a Muslim American, but as an American in the Middle East and in Africa, was I found that people are people everywhere you are. In fact, I would argue that in many ways, the goodwill of the people in Cairo, I think, supersedes what I experienced in New York City. I found much more hospitality amongst citizens of Cairo or Rabat in Morocco as an American, before they even knew I was a Muslim, than I found in other places. So I would argue that as individuals, I don't think that hate or that animosity is there. That does not exclude, obviously, individuals. You always have individuals. You always have angry people. You always have people that will attack an individual because we know that a Sikh man was shot by a white American because he had a turban on after 9/11. And so when a Kuwaiti attacks a Canadian because he sees his Muslim brothers being bombed by Americans and thinks this unfortunate Canadian is an American, when he attacks him and stabs him, we look at it differently from how we look at this white man shooting a Sikh, because we see that as an isolated incident that is not reflective of the overall population. But when the same incident happens in the Muslim world, we interpret it as this is an expression of the collective consciousness of an entire nation. I mean, the prejudice is deep. It's very deeply rooted. So I would argue we have an immense amount of work to do. And the work here is different from the work there. I just did a 30-day series that was aired on Muslim Broadcasting Corporation channel, which is a Gulf channel, and it goes out to about they estimate about 20 million viewers in the Arab world. And I had a half-hour segment every day during Ramadan. And what I was trying to do in that program was to humanize people in the West. So we walked around London and Granada and Paris and just talked to people with these Arab youth and asked them what they thought about Islam. And I literally saw these men in tears, these Saudi youth that were with me at the Alhambra Palace when we stopped two Canadian girls who had just visited the Alhambra Palace, which is one of the most visited places in the world, and certainly considered by many architects to be the greatest aesthetic feat of human architecture. When I asked them what they thought of Islam, one of the girls said, culture, civilization, progress, medicine, art, beauty, calligraphy, music, and she went into this stream of consciousness. Now, that could have perhaps just been the result of visiting the Alhambra Palace, because that would certainly do it to somebody. But it also could have been the result of her being a reasonably educated Western person who knew something about the history of Islam and was not willing to judge 1,400 years of civilization based upon a bad period that the Muslims happen to be going through today. In the same way that it would be an injustice to look at the West based upon the feudal period, based upon the children's crusades, based upon the racism. I mean, we can't simply say that that's all there is, because that's not all there is. And this is another major problem that we have, is how do we determine how we judge individuals and cultures? To give you an example, we have a president in this country, and many presidents, I could use many of them as examples, but I'll use one, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is considered a populist president. He is somebody who had very high popularity during his time. The White House was trashed on his inaugural evening because he let the hoi polloi into the place so everybody could come in, and they trashed the place. But that was a celebratory event to show the democracy of the people. Now, he was also a notorious Indian killer. He completely rejected John Marshall's Supreme Court judgment on the Cherokee people that they had a right to defend themselves against white settlers, and eventually forces the Cherokee people to go on the famous Trail of Tears to their westward migration. That's an odious aspect of the man's life. But do we judge the man's life based solely on the bad that he did? If I was a Cherokee, I think I probably would incline towards that assessment of him, for a number of reasons, obviously. But in an attempt to be fair, I have to look at the man's life in its totality. And I think the same could be said about the founding fathers of this country. The same could be said about any civilization. The same could be said about the United States today. That there are very many aspects of this country that I think we're all proud of, and we should be proud of. But there are other aspects of this society and this country that we should not be proud of, that we should feel shame, because we cannot, given the flammability of the current world situation, we cannot say our country right or wrong. We have to point out the wrongs and stand by what's right. And I would say that's absolutely sound, ethically, based upon the principles that this country was founded upon, and based upon also the Islamic tradition. So for the Muslims, that is as valid, because the Quran says, be witnesses unto humanity, even against yourselves. وَلَوْ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِكُمْ, even against yourselves. That this is a commandment, according to Muslim belief, of God. And this is where truth has to prevail over tribe. That we cannot stand by our tribe. We have to stand with what is right. And I feel that this country, unfortunately, and I really say this unfortunately, I feel that this country might not ever be able to get back the hope that people had in other places. I don't know. That remains to be seen. And anybody that looks at history is always very cautious about making judgments about the future, because history, although it has its patterns, those patterns can be very deceptive. So in terms of something practical for us as a community, I would say for the Muslims in the audience, we have a challenge in this country to recognize that we do not have to suffer the fate of so much of the Muslim world in terms of the ineptitudes that seem to precede so much of the attempts in the Muslim world to get out of the morass that they found themselves in. That we do not have to inherit the baggage of the Muslim world. That we are in a different place. We have different means. We have a freer society. And so I feel that in this country, we can carve out our own niche. Within the fabric of the American society, we can cut out our own segment of this tapestry. And we can be a shining example for the possibilities of Islam when it is allowed, or its adherents are allowed, to breathe free. And I do believe that. For the Americans who are not Muslims, I would say that our real challenge in this country is that we need to question first and foremost the policies of this country. We need to question the foreign policies of this country. We need to question the militarism of this country. We need to question the sanity of a $500 billion military budget to fight cavemen, when their best shot killed about 3,000 people. And yet 50 million people are facing death by AIDS in the African continent. So I seriously question spending $500 billion for homeland security when we have very serious problems on this planet that are threatening our existence. And if you follow epidemiology, which is one of my interests, if you follow epidemiology, you will know that there have been Cassandras amongst the epidemiologists for some time about the very perilous path that we have gone down in attempting to eradicate through antibiotics so many of these common organisms that continue to mutate and are becoming increasingly life-threatening. And we have to wonder why cows are getting mad cow's disease, why deer are getting mad deer's disease. I mean, these are things that should really be what we as a people are confronting. And that is not in any way to make light of what happened on September 11th, or to understand the importance of having security in one's home, because Maslow's hierarchy of needs, security is that first one, and people are willing to give up civil liberties very quickly, as they have done many times in this country when they felt a threat. And a threat is often the way the government in history has used to take away liberties that they were gained with such difficulty. And many of us forget, sitting in this auditorium, many of us forget the people that died for a just work week. The people that died so that people of color could sit wherever they wanted. Died. I mean, we forget that. We forget a lot of the struggle that took place in this country in order not to revolutionize the ideas of the country, to live up to the ideals that were already established in the country itself. And that is what's so extraordinary. There was no revolution of ideas. The revolution of ideas occurred 200 years ago with statements like all men are created equal. What had to be redefined was, what exactly do you mean by men? But the statement stands as sound today as it did when it was first uttered. So achieving ideals, and ideals are not utopian, ideals are achievable. Achieving ideals is what we as a community have to be committed to. We have to be committed to realizing the very ideals that this society was founded upon and has continually struggled to achieve, and has also continually redressed the wrongs when those ideals were compromised. And a beautiful example of that is in 1978, when Congress admitted the egregious error of incarcerating Japanese citizens in our state, California. And the Smithsonian Institute now honors that recognition by placing a segment in the National Museum of that crime against the Japanese Americans in California. And I challenge the Muslims in this audience to show me where in the Muslim world you will have museums that show the wrongs of the government or of the people against minority people. Where's the museum that tells us about the crimes against the Kurds, or the crimes against the Berbers, or the crimes against the Bangladeshis when it was East Pakistan? Where are those museums? Where is that admittance? No. Much of the Muslim world, and I would actually argue that the vast majority of the Muslim world, lives in deep denial, and in some ways to a lesser degree than the very denial that they are attacking the people in this country for living in. So I think for both of us, and I speak now with one foot in both worlds, for both of us, Muslims and American Muslims, we need to listen to each other. We need to listen to the criticisms that we put to the Muslim world, but we also need to listen to the criticisms that are coming from the Muslim world. And this is beautifully articulated in the statement of Imam Shafi'i when he was asked, how is it that you perfected your character? He said, I always took my enemies' criticism seriously to see if they had something truthful to say about my faults, because it is very difficult to see one's own fault. It's very easy to see the faults of others. And that's why it's very beneficial to listen to what others have to say about us. And what's interesting, and Imam Zayd and I were looking at a piece from Aristotle last night on anger. And Aristotle noted that people, when they were criticized, tended to become angry more about valid criticism than they did when they actually did not have the faults that they were being attacked for. So that is a very interesting psychological insight that I think both sides of the situation should look at. And I would end by saying that I do believe that conciliation is possible. It's not only possible, it's an imperative. Pat Buchanan said in a book, and Pat Buchanan, whether you disagree with him or not, I've read 3 of his books, and I've benefited from many of the points that he has had to make. There are many things I disagree with him, but I read Chomsky, and I read Daniel Pipes, and I read Edward Said, and I read Bernard Lewis. And I've never read, and I recently read David Horowitz, who published a libelous statement about me. And so I wanted to see who he was. So I went and I got a book and I read something that he wrote, and I agreed with quite a bit of what he had to say. And this is very difficult for us to do, to actually recognize that people do have valid points of view. People do have valid perspectives. We might not agree with everything they say, but to simply reject anything they say because we don't like them is the sign of a very ignorant person. Pat Buchanan said that this country does not want a war with Islam, because he said Islam is not like fascism. It's not an ideology that you can defeat. And he says in 3 very important words, Islam is indestructible. And he said there are 1,400 years of historical evidence to that statement. And I think that that's something that we have to recognize in this country. We do not want a war with Muslims or with Islam, no matter what their condition is, nor do the Muslims want a war with America. Because, as Bernard Lewis says, Westerners tend to forget that the real reason why they have so much supremacy in the world is because they have mastered the art of killing people better than anybody else in the history of man. We don't like to remember that little fact when we wave our flag about how great our society is. So that's what I feel, that it is possible. It's going to take an immense amount of work. All of you have contributions. Everybody in this room has a contribution to make in our society. We are fortunate to live in the Bay Area. I constantly tell my mother, this is not reality. Because she's very hopeful and saying, no, all my friends know it's wrong. And I said, this does not represent much of this country. And it is not that they're more stupid. It's not that they're worse people. No, much of it simply has to do with interaction, with knowledge. If your Muslim is a doctor, many of you will have a different experience of Muslims. But if you've never actually sat down with a Muslim before, if you never actually had coffee or